You can shoot me with your words. You can cut me with your lies. You can kill me with your hatefulness. But just like life, I'll rise.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
For years, churches in the African American community have stood as more than buildings or places to gather. Going to church was an event, one that helped to shape many leaders of yesteryear and helped to give them a solid foundation to raise their families and to build communities. New Prospect Baptist Church in Williamston, South Carolina, one of the oldest in the community, is celebrating its 150th anniversary. This church has produced teachers, doctors, elected officials, principals, and even council members. It's a legacy from which to build on as they move into the future.
We are a loving church, hospitable church. We are a church that cares about the community and do outreach in the community.
Pastor Darren Johnson is the current pastor of New Prospect, and after 7.5 years of leading the congregation, he's well aware of its rich history. The vestibule holds reminders of years gone by, with memories of who made an impact and helped to lay the foundation.
It's very interesting. The church really started around 1870. The church came out of a historically white congregation. Big Creek Baptist Church was about 1.5 miles from the church now.
New Prospect sits prominently on Greenville Drive in Williamston, and since it was built, it's given some African Americans a space and a place to worship in their own unique way. Longtime members say the church's original frame is a log cabin with bricks around it.
It was there at that particular church where some founders of the church, some black people found that they wanted to worship a little differently. So they left that church, they went to a brush harbor, from brush harbor to a log cabin. And around 1930 is when they built this church here, the current church.
It was in the 1930s when Franklin Roosevelt was elected President of the United States, and the Star-Spangled Banner became the U.S. national anthem, symbols that helped to shape a country and a community.
If you look at the church, the design of the church is in the shape of a cross. If you look at the arches of the church, the ceiling of the church is in the frame shape of a cross. There, the pillars of the church were built by the hands of the people who pretty much was members of the church.
The stained glass windows situated around the church offer the sunlight an opportunity to dance and radiate off of the unique shapes and colors. The windows are a statement of faith and support for the growth of the church, as those who financially supported their installation have their names prominently displayed. And the mural in the baptistry that overlooks the congregation has been on the wall for years. The picture carries decades of sentiment as it proudly displays the artist's signature.
Of some of the mothers of the church and the fathers of the church, if you will, to leave the job of the mills to come here and put up with the things of the mill to come to the church to get a word from God.
As New Prospect serves as one of the prominent churches in the community, it also serves as a refuge, a place for people to see and be seen, a place to gather, to learn from the Bible. It also served as one of the first schools in the community and a place to put your best foot forward.
Once again, because of the tiresome days that they go through from Monday through Friday, they were looked upon as a nobody. But when Sunday came around, when they came to church, the house of God, they wanted to dress up to feel like they were somebody. So they always, the men always had on a suit and tie. The ladies always dressed up from the shoes to the pocketbook to the hairstyle, if you will, wear a glove, because it was there at the church that they felt like they were a child of God.
The previous pastor before Pastor Johnson was Dr. Norman Pearson. He led the church for 42 years, keeping the strong heritage alive. Pastor Johnson and the current members of New Prospect continue the church's mission with constant Christian living to grow the church and community. Leading by example, New Prospect offered COVID testing to the community during the recent pandemic.
It's very important for me as a pastor, not only be a church on a corner, but be effective in the community. This church has always done that. Our church now currently is one of the only churches here in Williamston in this area that's on the National Registry for voter registration as a church, not individually, but as a church.
The church is still following its rich tradition of educating by offering tutoring sessions for students. They also make the effort to help entire families through their feeding program, and when the temperature drops, they offer free coats to all who are in need.
If something needs to be done in the community to move something politically, socially, or spiritually, New Prospect has always been a church that the community can count on.
There are an abundance of churches in Williamston, South Carolina now, but during segregation, there were only a few. One house of worship, originally named Bethel AME, later changed its name to Bethel United Methodist Church. It held a prominent place in the parishioners' hearts and sat on a main street in town. Bethel, defined as holy place, served as a sanctuary for the people for more than 136 years. Before there was a building, they met under a tent. In 1876, the first pastor of the church worked with the trustees to secure the land and build a building.
Just before the building was built, the land had to be purchased. So there were some trustees that bought the land, paid for the land, which was a sum of $1 for about 2 acres of land for the church to be occupied and built.
Bethel, one of 4 churches at the time in the Black community, had a tall steeple. Inside that steeple, to this day, sits a bell. When it rang in years gone by, it could be heard across the Black and white sections of town.
I took on the task of, especially on Sunday morning, if we had service at 10 o'clock a.m., I would make it my business to get to the church a certain length of time, like at least 15 or 20 minutes before the time of the service, and reach up there and pull down that long cord and ring that bell several times. That bell would be sounding all over the town of Williamston. And of course, I got a joy out of doing that too, because I was ringing the bell for them to come to church to worship the Lord.
The church building for Bethel UMC still sits on Greenville Drive. When it was first constructed, the building was so close to the road, the highway department had the building moved back several feet in order to widen the street.
And after it was moved back, there was a front was added on where you would enter the church. Before then, you would enter the church directly from the sidewalk of the street. When it rained, you can imagine the water standing out there, and you had to walk through the water and try to dry your feet off before you got in the church.
Churches sit in communities, and families occupy their pews. In the early years, there was support from the surrounding community, and especially from the families who attended the church.
Some of the family members that were faithful to the church from the very beginning were the Browns, the Curitons, the Ellises, the Jacksons, the Lyons, McLeans, McGrayers, Miners, Moores, Nashes, Royals, Sizers, Sullivans, Taylors, Thompsons, Valentines, Wares, Williams, and Wrights. Those were faithful members that attended the church.
Families would faithfully bring their children to learn in Sunday school and to participate in many of the other activities.
It was very important because that was a place where we could go. We knew we could go to worship. And of course, during that time, segregation Prevail was in progress, and of course, each race would go to their church. At that time, unlike today, we can attend any church that we might, regardless of denomination, racial features.
There were only a few churches for African Americans to attend. They were close-knit and sometimes intermingled, like Bethel and New Prospect.
We had a close relationship for many years. The children of the church didn't hardly know which church they belonged because they went to both churches. And we had adult choir members that sang at both churches also.
In 2007, the Reverend Brenda Washington broke barriers as the first female pastor of Bethel United Methodist Church in Williamston.
She was sent to the church to fulfill the pastorship when Reverend J.W. Budden, who was pastor at that time, became very sick and hospitalized. The doctors at the hospital had given up hope for him and did not expect him to survive. The Supreme Doctor, Lord Jesus Christ, intervened and brought Reverend Budden out of the hospital during Bethel's next church homecoming service.
Homecoming service was an annual event for current and former members to come together, and with the former pastor being released from the hospital just in time for the festivities, it made the celebration even more special.
Well, first of all, homecoming service was usually held every year, and that's where people that belong to the church, people might be outside the community, as far as out of state, would come and worship together.
The last program held at Bethel before the permanent closure focused on the family. It was the Sizer family reunion, a part of Willie Wright's bloodline.
Family reunions, good thing to have because it brings the people together in a group and with association, and reminding them of times they used to be.
At one time, Bethel was the only United Methodist church in the Williamston community. Reverend Kalitha Benson was the last pastor to serve before it was permanently closed. Some church members wanted it to stay open, while others didn't. By the time the final vote came to close the church for good, there were only 5 members remaining. Willie Wright was one of them.
To see a church being closed is heartbreaking, but at the same time, you have to go along with what the conditions were at the time.
For Wright and many others who walked through these doors and spent so much time inside these walls, knowing the doors would never open again wasn't easy, but it also wasn't the end.
Even though the church was being closed, that we still could worship the Lord in our hearts, because it wasn't exactly the building that we worship. We worship God, and we could do Him without a building. It's what we have in our hearts to do.
Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Williamston, South Carolina, established in the 1800s, continues to impact the community today. The purchase of the first 3 acres of land for the church was in 1870. A few years later, the members managed to buy a few more acres to expand the church grounds. The original services were held in a brush arbor, a one-sided shelter. No building to surround them, only their faith. 2021 marked 151 years of existence for Mount Pleasant, and although it's considered a rural church, its impact is as deep as its history.
During the early part of the 20th century, this was a farming community. You had a lot of people that did sharecropping or maybe lived on owners' property that maybe picked cotton, and there was a community that was that surrounded the church.
Those same hands that picked cotton were the same ones that put wood planks together to form the first church building. The original look of the church was very different from the current structure. Built in this same location, it started out as an L-shaped white clampboard building, which was common for the time. It faced many renovations since then, including the current configuration, which was laid out in the 1950s. Deacon Darrell Madison's grandfather helped to lay the foundation of the current edifice.
This church was built in 1953, and over the years it has went through renovations, additions. We had a fire that destroyed, well, it didn't completely destroy the sanctuary, but we had significant damage to our sanctuary, and that was in the late 80s.
For the past 10 years, Reverend S.A. Madison has served as the senior pastor for Mount Pleasant. He came out of retirement to fulfill this call and to continue the legacy of his family and the church.
My grandfather began his pastorate here in 1871. And at the same time, my great-granddaddy was on the deacon's ministry at that particular time.
Mount Pleasant, one of 4 main churches in Williamston with an historic connection.
This particular church, Mount Pleasant, I think that it has shaped a great deal of the African-American culture in this area, because over the years it has had some very powerful preachers with powerful messages, and where you will find in many churches the culture shapes the church. I think with Mount Pleasant you would find that the church has really shaped the culture.
During the height of national unrest, this church, like many others, served as a meeting place and even a safe haven.
I'm sure that a lot of things were discussed right here in the church, probably during the 50s and the 60s, during the Civil Rights Movement. We probably had a number of members that have gone on that participated in the Civil Rights Movement.
More than freedom fighters emerged from these pews. There were preachers, educators, politicians, business owners, and solid families that helped to bring stability to the community.
My father in those taught me that, look, don't look at a white lady. That was my mindset. And so I would walk down the streets of Winston, past Wilson's Meat Market and all of that, with my head down. Most Caucasian men my age don't know what it would be like to walk down a street in Williamston and not be able to just look at people.
Even in the midst of verbal and physical abuse, church congregations and close-knit communities served as a place of refuge.
And I'm sure that those people, they would come into this setting, meet in the brush arbor, get a good fiery word from the preacher, and they would be fired up to go out and face whatever was going to come at them from the larger society. And it was that faith that continued to make them lift their heads.
Although Reverend Madison, who is nearly 80 years old, and Deacon Madison are not related, they both have a deep connection with Mount Pleasant and these grounds. It goes back decades. That history and many memories sealed in the graves that stand tall with dignity, unlike many could do in life. The silence speaking of the lives once lived and the many destinies unfulfilled.
And I've seen the promised land.
When I was asked to make some comments in regard to Ms. Williams, I just came up with one word that I feel would describe Ms. Nadine, and that's mother.
Miss Nadine was a classic.
The M would be for motivator.
And she was set on our being able to speak properly.
Yeah, she was a disciplinarian.
My mom and dad had a nice car. It was a Buick Roadmaster. It was an experience because people, you know, the officers, as you go through these states, the southern states, would wonder how this black family could afford such a car and where they were going and all that. So we would get stopped on occasion.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.